Hey,
Hello.
Hello, everybody.
hello, hello.
Hendrik, we missed you last time. Thought we were gonna do your Java SDK demo.
Oh, we can do it today if you want.
Yeah, I think that was like the only thing on the agenda pretty much. So
Oh, nice.
yeah, if you're down, I'm down.
So I just posted the link to this meeting in some channels. Maybe we wait some minutes if somebody else attends.
Yeah, we usually give it like 4 to 5 minutes.
Yeah,
People filter in. Yeah, maybe like one more minute.
yeah.
All right, we can probably go ahead and get started. Um, Looks like it's a bit of a smaller crowd today, but that's okay. Um, but yeah, I mean, the only thing we have on the agenda is your prototype demo, Hendrik. So you good to just take it away?
Well, sure, I can do that. Let me.
I'll let you share.
Yeah. So, yeah, I have two things I would like to share. Maybe we start with this one. So, I created a small presentation, which is more or less like 3 slides because I already discussed that with Richard and needed that to show it to Richard as an example. So what I did, and this is not specific to the Java SDK, that is more specific to like our SDKs in general. And what I did is I looked at the SDKs from a perspective of a developer experience, like how easy is it to understand our APIs, how easy is it to use our APIs in a wrong way, um, and what can we do to make them more understandable and not allow to use it in a wrong way or allow the guests to use it in a wrong way. And so what I have here, is it readable for everything or is it too small?
No, I
Although,
think it's just fine.
yeah. So I mean, we don't need all the commands. I think I can join in. So what we see here is like some code that I created with 1 hour SDKs, which shows a little bit like the worst thing you can do with our SDK. So this is like how wrong can you use our SDKs? And here we have several things that are problematic from my point of view. And I think I can. Do you see that when I paint?
Yep.
Perfect. Okay, good. So so let's start with that. This is like one of the most common things we do in our SDK. I'm not talking here about that this is quite Hedera specific and do not make that much sense from an Hiero point of perspective. The bigger problem is here that we create a client that is used later, and this client has no operator account. So it's quite easy to just create a client without an operator account. And this is the method that most people call and then set an operator account afterwards. Why? I assume for most use cases, especially for something like the Java SDK where it's used on the server, having an operator account is something that would totally make sense. Um, what I'm doing now is I execute a transaction, which is an account create transaction. So just creating a new account. And one thing I can do when creating a new account and putting in the key for an account, I'm allowed to put in a private key here, which should be in general a public key. So that is one problem that I'm found, but that is only a small problem. The bigger problem is here with the flow, because what we normally do is that we create a transaction, set all the values of the transaction. That is what we do here. Then we freeze the transaction, we sign the transaction, and send it away. The problem is that the API that we have today has zero problem with signing the transaction before freeze is called. So the API just allows that, which will end in an error when just calling freeze on such transaction. Next to this, we could call freeze after a transaction has been signed. And the other thing is we could mutate the transaction and the internals of the transaction after sign and or freeze has been called, which both should not be possible. And after freeze, at least it ends in a direct error, but that error happens at runtime, right? So you don't see it here in your code. It just happened at runtime. Let me see. Oh yeah, that was something. Oops. Give me a second. I wanted to move the Zoom window away. So this is something I was just missing when created this, because normally in such scenario, what you want to do is use your operator account to sign a transaction, and I do not have any API to really do that. The only thing I had is like store the operator account upfront somewhere and then later use it here. Let's assume, so we had some problems here, but let's assume the API has been used up to this point in a correct way, which means you created a transaction, set everything like all the attributes, then freeze it and then sign it. So doing it in the right way. And then we execute it to receive a response, and out of that response receive a receipt or a record, up to what you want. Independent if you work with a receipt or later with a record, you now have access to a lot of things that do not make any sense. So when you have an account create transaction, in the receipt, you have things like file ID. So, and why I know where it's coming from when going down to the protobuf, for a developer who's using the SDK and who has an account create transaction, it's just, you know, he could misinterpret it or misuse that to have information like a file ID. And it's not only file ID, right? If you create a file, you would have an account ID in the recipe that is used for a new account being created that then is just null, which again is something that does not make much sense for that kind of transaction. The other thing is that while here on top we work with methods and have getters and setters, I think I never have a getter used anywhere. When it comes, and that is Java only now, that is a Java program only, or at least I have not looked into the other languages for that. To the responses, you need to do direct access. There are no getters or something for fields like that. So you really need to get access to those fields. And yeah, in the record, you have the same problem, right? So while we work with account create transaction, I could now do like contract function result contract ID, which again makes from a workflow perspective absolutely no idea, makes absolutely no sense. And all those is from my point of view when it comes to developer experience kind of misleading because you have way too much open API in the given scenarios that you do not use, that don't make sense in those scenarios, and that allows to create different workflows and a wrong usage of the API. So with that in mind, what I did is, let me now remove all that. Okay, here we go. So with that in mind, what I did is I created an updated, and now I need to move out a little bit, an updated model on how the flow that we do on an SDK when executing a transaction could look like. So the main difference is here that in our current SDKs, all the things we have here on top is packed in one class, record, however you want to call it, while I have it put here in two. We will have a look later into that. And then here in the bottom, while the response is more or less on this diagram, first of all, look same, it will specifications will come, or specializations will come into it when we look into this code. I changed a little bit on this record and recite and how that works. Another thing I changed is, and when I now remove everything again, that I defined all APIs to be async first, and synchronized calls can be based on top of that, because it's always super hard to create to create async calls based on synchronized functionality. So the right way to do that is to do async and create synchronized on top. And in the Java SDK, for example, it's currently more or less like there are two different workflows if you call it async or sync, as an example. And by doing this split here in the top, by having those two classes, I created the general transaction, which could be the account create transaction, create account transaction, that is mutable, where you can do like set memo, set initial H bar, whatever, get those things. And then what is freeze today, I think instead of freeze, the word pack would make more sense. Instead of calling it on the object and continue to work with this object, what this method does, it returns an immutable object, which is this packed transaction or frozen transaction, however you want to call it, which is immutable, which has no getters of any attributes anymore, and that can only be signed. By doing so, here we cannot sign, and here we cannot set attributes, which ends in an API that does not allow a wrong usage. So you can set, pack, sign, send. You cannot use it in a wrong direction or in a wrong way. What I added to get back from here to here is this unpack, or you could call it unfreeze, however you want to name those, which would create, if you have a packed transaction and call this unpacked, a new instance of a transaction where all the attributes are set like it was stored when calling this pack. Maybe we can have a look at code, how that looks like when I go to this one. So this is now a Java API, and what it does is I have this account create transaction, and you already see it here, right? And here I have an account create transaction where I call this with, and then I call this pack transaction, and that results in a packed transaction. So we do not have an account create transaction anymore. And if I do a dot here, I would not be able to call something like with key, set key, with initial balance, set initial balance, because the API just do not allow it. So a user who's using our APIs for the first time would not be able to do a wrong workflow at all. And what you see here is why I said asynchronous calls first should be the default to make it easier. I have created next to send, which is currently more or less like the execute, send and wait, which does nothing but calling send, the asynchronous one, and wait until it's done, which results in a response, and then I could get the record by calling a query, which would result in a record. And you already see one specification here that I do not have here, like today, a generic response and a generic record. I have an account create response and an account create record. And by doing so, this account create record has a method like created account or get account, however you want to call it. But you could not call something like get contract ID or get file ID, because this API do not exist at all, because we work here with a concrete account create record that has really only this concrete information, like that is the created account, that is, I don't know what information are interesting for an account create response, maybe how many H bar has the creation costed, and so on. So maybe that as an first overview of the API. What I can do now is let me stop sharing that one and open the project in IntelliJ. There we have some other things in it. Where's Zoom? Here's Zoom. Oh, I see there's a comment in the chat. Oh, hey Andrew. Great to have you here. So let's have a look. So this is my playground where I currently work with all that. One thing I learned while doing it, another deep dive I did is into how to handle protobuf. And the more I worked with it, the more I believe that we really need to do this split between the SDK and the generated protobuf files, because those should be a kind of dependency that we have coming from consensus node. And by having those changes, I could work in the SDK without having, to update any protobuf things or anything like that. I believe that this is another point. I don't have that in the slides, but that's another point that totally makes sense to do that split. So when going into, let's open the sample here. And maybe we start from scratch, or maybe we create a sample 3. Let's just create it and say we start from scratch here. So one thing I did is I next to where's the problem here? Oh, it does. Let's do it like that. Like that. Okay. So another thing I did here is what I learned that when I started to work against a solo-based network, which is currently quite hard for our SDKs, I created this functionality that says, hey, here's my operator account. Please create a client for this operator account and for this network identifier. And the network identifier is based on an SPI naming where everybody could do implementations of configurations that are based on a name. So this Hedera testnet is, we can have a look at that somewhere in my configuration. Network settings. Let me check where I have an implementation here. I have 2, Hedera testnet and Hiero. So here's the implementation of the configuration of the network. I currently only run against one node, right? To make everything super easy. That should be more complex for a real SDK. It's more about the pattern. And then I have a unique identifier, and I can easily use that unique identifier to run against the network with that name, where I then get the full configuration. And the nice way is by using an SPI. If somebody has a custom network, or somebody is running something like an HashSphere network, you only need one jar with one class in it that looks like this. And you need to have this jar at runtime on your class path or execution path when it goes to go and things like that. And then you can dynamically load everything just by this name and know that you have the right configuration. Okay, so let's say I have an account create transaction. So let's have a look. What can I do? I can do like with key, with initial balance, get key, get initial balance. What I do not can do is sign. I do not have an API to sign here. And it don't make sense to have an API to sign here, because signing should not happen until freeze or packing the transaction has been executed. So let's say we do set account memo, like this new account created. we still have an account create transaction, so we could set more stuff like, oh, I don't want to call set, I wanted to do with, to have a fluent API. So I could do like, I don't know, with key, yeah, sure, we need to define the key that is used for the, how to say it, for the account. What I could do now is I could say I want to pack that transaction. And packing this transaction, as said, is what is in the current APIs called freeze today. For sure, to do that, I need to define a client where all the gRPC stuff and things like that is coming from. And now that I have a packed transaction, I cannot call anymore with account memo or something like that. The only thing I can do is I can send it. And here I can do an asynchronous send, which is just calling the send function, what returns the asynchronous return type for Java. Or I could say send and wait. And best case to when calling something like that is always to say like, I want to have an, like period that I want to wait a max or an error is thrown. And since I have sent that now, I now have a response where I, for example, could get the transaction ID. That is something I could now get out of the response. I cannot get super detailed stuff here, but what I could do is I could now query for a result. And again, I do not call the async call, I do the sync call. So let's say again, we wait for 10 seconds. And now I have next to the status, which is just the status code of the transaction and the transaction ID, I have specific APIs that are specific to the account create transaction. So I cannot access now something like a file ID because it don't make sense for that account type. But what I could access is a created account. And now I could store the account ID here, which is an account ID. And by doing so, I really have an API that does not allow me to move in a wrong direction. And really guide the user with functionality the user can use and only exposes things that make sense, or that it's not even make sense, that are allowed in that case. Because signing and then setting something is just not allowed. That is, first of all, the prototype I have so far. I did some other improvements when it comes to gRPC and things like that. But I think the most important point about making them more easy to use is really this: you're not allowed, or you cannot break it, you cannot do it in a wrong way thing. That is what I wanted to show first of all. Are there any questions on that? Or comments? Whatever.
No, I was gonna say I feel like this implementation like addresses a lot of pain points that people have had. I know at least back when like HIP 745 came out, that's one that allowed you to send transactions without automatically setting like transaction ID, node account ID, like being able to pass like the raw bytes of a transaction between like wallets and apps, for example. If an app needed to get a signature from a wallet, it could send it there and be able to get its signature and then send back that kind of use case. I think something like this could help with that. I also believe at the time even that there was some uh an opinion that was brought up. I don't remember by who, but that was saying basically just like we shouldn't even have freeze. Like freeze doesn't make sense. It's just an extra step that
That's another point. Yeah. So I was, when I did a deep dive, I was all the time, why do I freeze at all? You know,
Mhm.
because you could do like when the first time sign is called, it's already freezing, right? So
Right.
that,
Yep.
that is something else I was thinking of. For me, it was now, okay, let's do not change everything. Let's try to keep kind of the workflow we have, but make it more strict and more solid. I agree, in theory, freeze is not needed. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, it's kind of one of those things I feel like where it's you know how like how how much do we want to let potentially a new developer shoot themselves in the foot? You know, like
Yeah,
maybe
exactly. Yeah.
maybe there's
Yeah.
some things that we should you know make easier for them, but also then it's like you might have more experienced developers that may want to have like more manual control and kind of have those more like advanced use cases where they're passing transactions between wallets and apps and everything. But yeah, I mean, I like the pack transaction, calling it pack as opposed to freeze. I think that the kind of at least in my head, it kind of makes more sense. But yeah, Keith.
So I always assumed we had freeze transactions to deal with the start stop consensus timestamps. Is that not true?
So, freeze right now, it generates the transaction ID and node account IDs for the transaction if the user has not set them manually. Um, but basically, I think the thought was back in the day when there was talk about, you know, potentially taking freeze out or just trying to figure out why we had it. It would basically just be like, yeah, kind of like what Hendrik says, like it would happen at the first signing of the transaction. So a user could go and execute and not even have to bother freezing or thinking of anything about that. But when the client would go in and or the operator would go in and sign it, that's when all the freezing would take place, i.e., the transaction ID and the node account IDs get generated. But that functionality would still be available. Like we wouldn't take those APIs out for the user to do that. It
Yeah.
would just kind of minimize the amount of steps.
Yeah, and I believe so. As you can see, that is currently, I mean, call it freeze, call it pack, whatever. What it really does, it creates the client ID and also the transaction ID, and the transaction ID is time-based, right? So, Keith, you are right when saying freeze sets a timestamp because that is kind of what this one does. And maybe I don't know, maybe there are scenarios where you want to freeze and not directly sign and send. You want to freeze and then do something else and not do the signing. So for that,
Yeah, I mean, I was just running the documentation on the HSM stuff. So, I mean, that's just one example, right? But HSM, you want to freeze, send it to your HSM, sign, send it
yeah,
back, submit,
yeah,
I mean, which could take 1 second or it could take a long time. Right?
yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Maybe pack or freeze, however you want to call it, is a must currently for those use cases. Yeah. So what I assume is a nice API would allow you to call sign, which if it's not freezing, do freeze and then sign, like an example.
I guess my other question, Hendrik, is what is being, I mean, this is great, but what is being asked for? Are from my understanding, you're not asking to deprecate anything. You're asking to add new
Yeah.
functionality to all SDKs.
Yeah, no. So I mean, what this is coming from a request from Richard about how can we make all that more solid and better for developers. And what I've shown here is nothing we can, I mean, like implement tomorrow and then have it. That includes a lot of change. So let's say like this includes really changes in the public API for sure. And And that's why I call this a prototype, like a playground about how could future APIs look like. This is nothing where I would say we should implement that the next 2 months and change our current APIs to that. This is more like maybe we can create an incubation project about how could future APIs look like, play with all that, figure out what would be the best API to do so. And once we know that and have a solid understanding of everything, we could create a HIP to say like, hey, we want to move our APIs in 9 months, whatever, in a new major version into that direction. It's more about that. So it's really about the future.
So, sorry, I'm just gonna put on my PM hat here. So like, to do that kind of change, I don't question it might bring value. It will also bring disruption. So I guess my question would be, has anyone, maybe I'll turn this to Robert. Have you ever heard, yes, of course we could improve the APIs, but has anyone actually requested this or asked for this or because, we break a lot of code when we make this, if we're changing APIs, or are we not going to break code? And is then that worth the pain? Is that benefit worth the pain?
So I have seen a lot that people used it in that way and that it don't work and they needed to check it. Even I did it when I started working with the SDKs, that it was quite hard to understand and to understand the flow and all that. So I would say I agree. It creates friction. It creates changes, disruption. Totally agree on that. That's why I say that is nothing we want to have tomorrow. This is more about we have a green field. How could an API look like that is really as developer friendly and good to use as possible? And from that point of view, from my point of view, we then need to check what can we maybe port to our SDKs, what can we take without having people that need to change everything. Can some things maybe live next to other APIs? That is something we need to figure out as a next step. And we don't have numbers, but I would say a clear yes that those problems or that people have exactly those problems. I've seen it when I did at the German university teaching half a year smart contracts and how to use our SDKs. I did some workshops about how to use SDKs. I mean, if we show everything in a video and people do it step by step from that video, for sure they won't have those problems. But if you set somebody just to our SDKs and say, hey, let's play with it, try it out, people will end at exactly those problems.
So I'm just trying to think back. I also remember I struggled with freeze and when to use freeze, and it was very painful.
Yeah.
Now, I just want to put a suggestion out there. Maybe it was that. Also, I also thought it was maybe because, and sorry, this falls back on us. Our docs were not very good around the need, like when to freeze, stuff like that. Like maybe there was a docs gap about why it caused a lot of confusion about the freeze functionality. So maybe that's something we have to address.
I don't think so. I mean, that is let's go into the extreme, right? So the extreme would be we do not have concrete data types, everything is generic, and we have a documentation, and you need to understand the documentation, how everything works. The other extreme is you do not need a documentation at all because you can only use the API in the right way. I believe both things are wrong. And I believe a good one would be having a documentation, but an API that makes, or let's say like an API that does not allow you to create totally wrong workflows with it. And because especially developers, yeah, we have a documentation, AI will use it, but most developers I know, first of all, try things before they look into any external documentation, especially documentation that is not like when going, yeah, I do not have any Java doc, but that is like in code documentation. I assume that we used a lot, but there it will be hard to define those workflows and things like that. So I don't believe that only documentation will help at that point. But I agree, it's something we need to figure out how much change do we want to have to make the things work better.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of just see this as like almost like a V3 like prototype.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, like you said, we wouldn't try and make these, just just out of the blue. Like we'd have to kind of think, because this is like pretty much I mean, not like a completely whole new architecture, but like, yeah, like the APIs we're providing, like a lot of them are going to change and the workflows are going to be different. I kind of equate this like if we were to try and implement this, like we'd have to implement this, but then also keep supporting what we already have for, the certain amount of time, 9 months, a year,
Yeah.
whatever, to kind of allow that for people to switch over. But I mean, I like it. I think it's more intuitive, at least like the just from seeing kind of what you showed us here. And yeah, I like the pack, and I also like the unpack too, because I know in our current API we can freeze, but then once it's frozen, you can't go back the other way. Which I think could be helpful. But yeah, the pack and the unpack I think is good, and that kind of help too with those use cases where if apps and wallets want to send transactions between each other, they can easily the pack and unpack. I feel like makes it a bit more streamlined.
And that is a nice one, right? I can really like unpack and then set something that is specific for account create, and then pack that again and continue. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, because like some of the errors and use cases we were seeing is the DApp would have its own client, its own list of nodes on the network that it's using. It would generate transactions based on those nodes. It would send it to the wallet to get signed, and then the wallet would have its own separate collection of nodes. And or Wait, no, sorry, I got that back. I got that messed up. The wallet would generate their own, transaction they would want to send. Use have those like node IDs, then send it back to the DApp to send to the network, but the DApp wouldn't have the same nodes anymore, and we would just get like a bunch of errors. Or people would get those like invalid node account IDs. Um, but yeah, no, I think this is good. I like this.
Well, Robert, what would be the next? I mean, I would think that we would need to present this to the broader SDK team, certainly also SIMI. What would be the next possible steps to explore this as you and Hendrik suggest?
I believe I need to create some more, like architecture documentation about what I have created here, especially when it goes a little bit deeper. And so I have this account create transaction now partly working because the query record is not implemented. So for me, the goal is to have one transaction, and so the API is there, but if I would call that, an error will be thrown at runtime. So that is something I want to do, is to have for one transaction just everything working. And yeah, then this could be something to add a documentation, a draft about future SDK architecture to the SDK hub. Maybe we can create a GitHub discussion there. This is just a repository under GitHub/Hendrik Ebbers. It's a public repo where all that is, and then start a discussion. I assume that would make sense, and see what people like about it, when people maybe, because I don't know if I see everything, right? So there are so many use cases, maybe people directly see like, oh yeah, but by doing it like you did it, this or that use case will not work anymore. So having such a discussion for some time would make sense. And I believe this is nothing where we need to hurry. This is really like moving to the future. Maybe then next year or at the end of this year, we can say like, oh yeah, that is the architecture we would like to have in the future, and can then decide a plan on how we want to go forward.
Yeah, no, we still have that discussion in the SDK hub too about V3. People have just kind of been posting there about things they want to see, and yeah, additional APIs we may want to add. So I think maybe we can post a link to this in there, and then yeah, I mean maybe Keith, we can talk with Simi and yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess Hendrik, you've already talked to Richard about this too, so maybe this would be like this is something we take to the TSC, maybe?
I don't know. So I would, I mean, this is very technical, and not defined. This is now like Hendrik's pitch. Let's see it like that. And I would really like to discuss this in the SDK community first before we move anything to the TSC. Because I like what I did, but now we need feedback and understand if all that makes sense, and so on and so on before we move it to the TSC. I assume nobody in the TSC has any problem with us playing with possible future APIs, but as long as we do not say like, hey, this is now the architecture we want to have defined in a document, or this is our roadmap for SDK v3 or something, I believe it's too early to go to the TSC.
Yeah. So my suggestion, Henrik, if you're going to create documentation, why don't we just start by you creating a SDK design doc per the template, and we start with that and create the SDK design doc, then the SDK team can review, and then everyone can look at it, provide comments and feedback. So kind of like a HIP, and then go from there.
We can do that. I would even have started one point earlier and create a discussion in the repo. Because
Okay, yeah.
the design doc would be like, okay, here's a concrete PR with a concrete design I want to have. And I believe having a discussion first would make more sense.
Okay.
Cool.
Yeah, if you would you want a separate discussion for this, or would you want to just kind of tag this along on the V3 discussion already?
To be fair, I have not looked into that one. I will look. I had no idea that we have that discussion, so I will have a look into that, and then I can decide that. Actually, I cannot say it.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think there's too much. It's been open for a while, but it's more so people just kind of posting ideas of what they would want in a video as opposed to actual discussion. So
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Maybe I create a new one and link it into that one. Like, oh, here's another idea, but this is a little bit more big but detailed, so I externalized it. Something
yeah,
like that. Yeah.
yeah, that
Good.
sounds good.
Cool. Okay.
Cool. Yeah, this was awesome. No, thanks for the demo. Yeah, I like what I see so far. I think it's good. Sweet. Yeah, that's all we had on the agenda today. Does anyone else have anything they wanted to bring up? Let me go ahead and open the floor.
Maybe just a call out, Robert. I think not any to do this myself. I think the Hiero hooks design proposal is out there, so maybe everyone can take a look and provide feedback.
The hip of for that one.
Oh, is
I
that
think
a
there's a Hiero hook SDK design proposal.
Ah,
So-
okay. Cool. Yeah, okay.
oh, yep. Yeah, that was opened 3 weeks ago, it looks like, yeah. Yep. So we still have that. Actually 1193 is still open too, but I think that one's approved. I just need to merge it. Yep, that's in PR in the hub. So anyone can go take a look at that. And I think that's all I had. All right. Thanks for joining, everyone. I'll catch you in
Mhm.
2 Mondays.
Bye.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you.